All right, welcome everyone. So here with us today, we have Julie Dale, and she is the Manager of Prevention and Education with STAR. STAR has a goal of reducing harm to Alaskans and responding to those who have suffered assaults. So Julie here oversees the strategic direction for prevention, education, and community partnerships, and she works to develop relationships with partner agencies, service organizations, and curricula for education. So she is here with us today to share her story on how she got involved with STAR and the future she'd like to see. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie, and thank you so much for joining us, Julie.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and doing this. Having this sort of be my specialty and be out and typically a lot of in-person and face-to-face pre-COVID, I'm really excited to have a little bit of an opportunity to continue the outreach. I'm going to reach up and dismiss a couple of things that's on the screen here, and then I'm going to start by kind of introducing myself a little bit, and I'm going to go over a little bit of the services that STAR provides throughout the community. I really encourage questions. I know that can be really, really challenging virtually, but I know that there's folks online here with us that are going to kind of moderate that, and I'll try to sort of space some of it out in case there are questions. So I'll kind of give space for that. And I am very new to Teams, but I've been practicing. So I'm going to go to sharing my screen because I really like to have multiple versions. So I'm hoping that we can all see the screen. That is
Yep.
up. Perfect. So we're going to start with just really basic, a little bit about me. I always feel that the stronger connection that we have to the people in our community, it's just a stronger knit community. So my name is Julie. I was born and raised in this amazing state of Alaska, and I absolutely adore it here. Those are just a few pictures of me doing things that I really, really love to do in Alaska. I love to fish and camp and play on the beach and cook and dog sled. And you'll hear a little bit more about some of that as we continue. But that's sort of the quick rundown of who I am. And then we're going to kind of jump into STAR services. So we're going to start with our basic mission. I am so privileged to be part of the most amazing organization. We've actually recently changed our mission within the last 6 months or so to put prevention first, which of course in my heart was everything, because all in all, we provide advocacy services and it's incredibly important. But big picture, we really want to prevent sexual trauma and provide comprehensive, collaborative crisis intervention, advocacy, and support to victims, survivors, their families, and our communities. It sounds a little bit wordy, but we know that sexual violence does not just impact individuals. It impacts everybody around them. And it takes everybody in the community to try to help prevent harm from happening. So the heart of our organization is our crisis line. And this is actually where the majority of people first come in contact with STAR is either through the crisis line or, surprisingly, like a community outreach or a presentation or booth. But we rely on a huge amount of amazing volunteers to keep our crisis line running. It's available 24/7. It's free and confidential, and it's actually available nationwide. So we have a wide variety of people that call, not just from Anchorage and Alaska, but from other surrounding states. Our presentations surprisingly reach a really wide audience. We'll go into that a little bit as well. STAR originated from the crisis line in 1976. It started by two women who saw a very desperate need for a crisis intervention hotline. It had 30 volunteers initially. And I think there was, around 85 calls in the first few weeks. So it was very clear in 1976 that this was a very needed thing in Alaska. And from there, it blossomed into the multifaceted agency that we have now. And so when most people think about STAR and any agency that's providing support surrounding sexual violence or domestic violence, we think of that one-on-one advocacy, which is incredibly important. That's that immediate crisis intervention that we provide to those who've been harmed by sexual violence. And that can look like a really wide variety of things. Pre-COVID, that looked like our advocates being dispatched 24/7 to assist individuals who had been assaulted. Right now, we are still providing that same support, but we're doing all of that via very confidential, not Zoom, but a Zoom-like platform. So people who've been harmed still have an advocate there to support them through the process. We provide long-term support because we know that trauma impacts everybody differently and the stages are very different. So we have individuals who we're supporting through years and years and years of healing and supporting their family. And we have individuals who contact us years later and thank us. And so we really keep those connections with a lot of people. We have an amazing in-house counselor. Her name is Eden. She is fantastic. She's been with us for, gosh, almost 8 years now. So we can provide in-house counseling. And right now, of course, that's again being done virtually, but we're still providing that service. And if Eden isn't the right fit for somebody, then she's going to work really hard to make sure that we find a counselor that is a right fit. We have a great case manager. Her name is Karen, and she's going to be helping provide individuals with housing, food support. Oftentimes, if people are harmed, sometimes they're having to give items up to be held for evidence. So we're going to help with clothing and cell phones, safe housing. That could look like security cameras or alarms for doors. So there's a really, really wide variety of services that we can provide. We don't have our own legal counselors, but our STAR advocates are very, very well versed in the legal system and can help start that conversation. The best way to connect with any of our advocacy services, if somebody feels like they could use them, or if they have a friend or an individual that they feel could use them, is through that crisis line phone number. Especially right now, since our STAR office isn't actually open, the crisis line is our major connection, and we have staff running that Monday through Friday during the day and volunteers, like I said, after hours. And then we get to prevention and education, which is where my team and I come into play. We have a very close-knit relationship with the Anchorage School District. We've had a relationship with the Anchorage School District for almost 15 years now, and we support the education that the teachers are able to provide around personal body safety and child sexual abuse prevention. It's age appropriate, so we talk to youth kindergarten through 12th grade, and the conversation sort of builds on itself and progresses as youth get older. They're hearing that same information from their teachers, their counselors, as well as STAR prevention professionals. So it's a sort of a 3-tiered approach. So they're really receiving a lot of support. Community-based trainings look like a really wide variety of things for us. We have a great partnership with the National Park Service. We have a great partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. I always just call it NOAA, and then whenever I have to say it, I stumble a little. But so we partner with a lot of different agencies, and we provide presentations to a lot of folks that just ask. So we've presented to women's groups in the Lions Club and Boys and Girls Club on a really wide variety of topics. We provide boothing, and all of this was a little pre-COVID. We're really working on how we continue this outreach now, and we're doing a pretty great job. But you know, in the past, we would be present at Pride, and health fairs, at the UAA campus kickoff, which is actually happening next weekend or the weekend after, and that's going to be our very first virtual booth experience. So I'm really excited to see how that goes, and I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to sort of continue that virtual booth and outreach experience. A little bit of an idea on some of the training topics that we provide. I'll just sort of leave that up and let folks look at it just a little bit. But each one of these topics are sort of a jumping off point from conversations that we can have with organizations and groups. And each one of our presentations is adapted to the specific group of individuals. So we might be talking about sexual harassment in the workplace, but that's going to look really, really different for like plumbers and pipe fitters versus the ALSK Club versus the National Park Service, because the work dynamics are so different. Even though the components of the power-based personal violence are the same, a lot of the dynamics can be really different. So we're really focusing you know, that targeted information for people. Bystander awareness and intervention is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because a lot of people can look over this list and feel like, well, I don't know where I fit into any of those, or I don't know where any of those fit in to my role or my organization. But bystander awareness and intervention is something that, even if we don't know what our role is, but we want to have a role, that's a great jumping off point. And it's really adaptable for anybody who wants to find a niche for themselves in the prevention of harm of people. That's a little bit of our contact information. So our business line, which is actually just being forwarded to the crisis line. So either one of those is going to work. The crisis line is the best point of contact if anybody wants to get a hold of us. And then, of course, at our website, staralaska.com, we have all of our current stuff that is happening. We're having a crisis line training coming up here, I believe, in September. We have a summer blog series, which is actually really exciting, that's being written by the prevention and education team. Last month's topic was on virtual consent and what virtual consent looks like. With everything that is happening right now, we talked a lot about boundaries and how to set some of those virtual boundaries, even with family and friends. So I feel like it's a really fun way for us to continue our engagement with the community. So I gave you a ton of information. I'm going to quit sharing this screen. I'm going to give a moment in case there were any questions that came up about STAR services, and then we'll kind of continue in with the rest of it.
I have a quick question on your last item, virtual consent.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what, I guess, on what this topic means and what kind of recommendations you, well, this is a really hot item right now, especially. What does that mean?
Yes, absolutely. So I will. I'm trying to figure out how to quit sharing my screen. And I guess I tap on you. I got it. Working on it. Okay, great. So virtual consent is actually a really interesting topic, and you know, the way that we started talking about this was consent is such an important conversation, and continuing the conversation about consent is key. And so we started, and I say we as the prevention and education team, we were like, okay, well, how do we continue talking to kids about consent through all of this? And so we were thinking about, with parents, you know, making sure that knowing who they're giving information to, knowing who they're talking to online, all of those kind of, that's where that sort of conversation started. And then we got to, well, what about, people that are social distancing and potentially asking partners, even if they're in a consensual, like even a married relationship, and maybe they're social distancing and not being able to live in the same home, and maybe they're wanting to be a little flirty over the phone, and maybe they're asking to sext, or maybe even asking or sending pictures of each other. And we're talking about consenting adults, and how do we have that conversation? So that starts by asking, is this something that you're comfortable with? And being open to the person saying, well, maybe or maybe not, but really starting that boundary conversation. And that consent, even virtually, is just as important. So even there's people that are, like Zoom dating and trying to meet people online, and what those boundaries are, and that consent is just as important, even though you're not in the same room with somebody. Another way that conversation went was really even talking about boundaries and consent, and a great way to start the conversation is just with your family and friends. I know that pre-COVID, my mom would call me before she came to my house. She'd text, she'd say, hey, can I stop by? What are you doing? And I'd say yes or no. But then when COVID hit, family and friends just started FaceTiming out of the blue without asking, hey, do you have a minute to FaceTime? And so we started talking about even setting boundaries and asking for consent with family and friends is a great way to start that broader conversation with people, because we really have a feeling that this is going to be sort of part of how we're interacting for a while now.
Does that conversation then bleed over into, people can steal your photos and stuff, or who knows who's scamming out on the web?
Yes, yes, that's a whole huge broad conversation. We actually have a really large presentation on virtual safety and what that looks like when pictures are out there. There's a lot of things that are actually kind of tied into when we talk about sexual assault and consent, like catfishing and scamming and photos that aren't real, and is that really consent, and is that not? And so there's huge conversations that can be had around that virtual safety. We do have some of those links up on our website right now. Really hoping to maintain that conversation, and know that once something is out there, even if it's an individual that you trust and that information can potentially just be out there. And so making sure that people are aware of the consequences, and they know what they're consenting to. Like, is this for you? Is that picture for you? Is it something that you want to share? I mean, like, really just starting those conversations.
The other thing that I was going to switch back to was your partnership with ASD. And so before, we had started this conversation, you had mentioned that you would go into the schools, you and your organization, and do week-long presentations. And how are you planning on doing that now under the current structure? And then I was also wondering, per those conversations, what kind of response or feedback are you getting from students at various age ranges?
Oh, so those are both really, really good questions. And, the first question, the first part of that is like, how are we going to continue this conversation? That's actually a really challenging question right now. I feel that the state, which is amazing, has mandated for the schools, it's mandated in the school districts to teach personal safety. So this is a required lesson. And we're actually just starting the conversation on how are we going to be able to do this virtually, and how are we still going to be able to support all of the students. So we're looking at a wide variety of options, and how we're going to be able to be there to support the teachers and still provide the lessons. So the Anchorage School District and STAR are getting together and having a meeting the very beginning of September to figure out what that looks like and how we're going to be able to support the school district and the work that they're already doing. And so I'm really not 100% sure what that's going to look like. But I know that a major component of having STAR be physically present in schools was giving youth an opportunity to have an individual to disclose to, if they wanted to, that they could identify as a really safe person. Youth respond really, really well to our presentations, but they don't like to disappoint adults in their lives. And so, for a lot of reasons, it's actually really hard for youth to disclose to teachers that they have a relationship with, even if it's a really good relationship, because they don't want to disappoint them, or they don't want to hurt those teachers' feelings, or they don't want those teachers to feel hurt. It's a, kids are so empathetic by nature that that's just sort of part of how they work. And so when we're physically there, it gives them an opportunity to have a person to disclose to. So that's one challenge that comes up with COVID and virtual presentations, and we're going to brainstorm with that and see how it works out. Our presentations that we give to youth are really, really empowering for youth. We make sure that we're giving kids skills to identify unsafe behaviors, and what to do if them or somebody they know is experiencing those unsafe behaviors. We also identify at STAR that it is ultimately an adult's responsibility to keep kids safe. So when we're giving these presentations, we make sure that we're never ever putting the onus of being harmed on a kiddo. Um, and knowing that we do have the highest rates in the nation of child sexual abuse, when we're presenting to youth, unfortunately, we identify that there's probably somebody in that audience that's been harmed themselves, is experiencing harm, or knows someone that has. So we really formulate the language very, very carefully to make sure that they know what's happening is not their fault, that they did nothing to make that happen, that even if they didn't tell, it's never too late to tell a trusted adult that something unsafe is happening. And even if they're not ready to tell now, it's never ever too late. We don't use anatomical names because we encourage that from adults and parents, but only the Anchorage School District teachers can use those in certain grades. So we use sort of a bathing suit model, and we talk about where private parts of your bodies are. And it's very, very safe language. Kids really like the presentations. I've been doing these presentations for 8 years in schools now, so I've actually seen kids from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade. And it's amazing to go back to the school and have first, second, and third graders go, "Oh, Miss Julie, you were here last year. Can I give you a hug?" And they remembered me from a year ago from one conversation that we had, and it's because we're really empowering youth with the knowledge that their body is theirs and they get to choose who touches them and when. And it's a great conversation that we have.
It sounds fun. What about like high school age students?
They're like the middle school and high school age students are actually really receptive to the conversation. And it's really interesting because, when I say, middle school and high schoolers, where sometimes there's the youth that might sort of say something a little mouthy and they're doing it to kind of get a reaction, or they're really uncomfortable with the conversation and they don't know what else to do. It's really interesting because other kids in the class would be like, "Oh, hey, dude, that's not cool." And like other kids will kind of shut that down and then speak up and say, "Hey, this is really important for us." They handle the conversation really well. It's cool. There was actually a group of young women at West High School who were so inspired by our conversation that they started a whole consent conversation club and started inviting people into this consent conversation. And they created these really cool posters, and they got a hold of STAR and they created this whole campaign and started doing like presentations to the whole school on how important consent
Wow.
is.
Mhm.
Yeah, so they really took that and ran with it. And I think that's great. So they're really receptive, and I think that you know, when I started doing this job, I didn't give our middle school and high schoolers nearly enough credit. You know, when I went in and I kind of like, and I learned right away that the majority of them really enjoy like knowing that they can do things to help prevent harm in our community. So they really take that on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm going to pause here. Does anybody else have any questions they want to jump in?
I have a quick one. Hi, thank you for being here, first of all. Have you noticed a uptick in calls and responses with people being quarantined and isolated in unsafe environments? I would love for that answer to be no, but I'm wondering if you have seen that uptick that some of us have been concerned about.
So it's a really interesting dynamic. And what is happening in the trend that we're seeing and the data that we're seeing, because we only have a little snippet of it at this time. But what we're seeing is that, yes, unfortunately, more people are experiencing power-based personal violence in the home. So there are more accounts of domestic violence and sexual violence that is happening within the home. The challenge with that is if you are quarantined with the person who's harming you, it's really hard to reach out and seek help. And so we might not be seeing that uptick in calls, but they're coming in a little bit retroactively. Really, unfortunately, we saw very recently a few homicides in rural areas where people were killed by their partners that they were being quarantined with because it was an even more of an isolated situation than they were even usually in. And so that's the biggest challenge right now is if someone's quarantined or isolated with their abuser, they might not have access to a telephone, that maybe that abuser might leave and go to work in the past, or go to a bar or go to the gym or do something out of the house, and they might have a resource that they can reach out to. And what we're finding right now is that they're having trouble reaching those resources, is what we're hearing from people.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so at Star, we've sort of been brainstorming and talking about, well, what do we do with that dynamic? And that's where the power of the community really, really comes in. Even though we're quarantining, I have the most amazing neighbors. Let me tell you, we check in on each other all the time. And she's got her own kiddos, and she's sort of um, fostering for the summer some of her family's kiddos. And the other day, one of her kiddos was screaming bloody murder because she did not want to clean out the backseat of the car. Like, she was like, no, I don't want to do it. But I took a moment and I figured out how to just check in on them. I just checked in. I went by like super social distance, and I said, hey, do you have some sourdough starter that I can borrow? I killed mine because I know that she does sourdough. And she's like, I totally do, and I will just come by and drop some on your porch. And it gave her just a moment to sort of, everybody just was like, oh, sourdough starter. Okay. She was like, you go get the jar. I'm going to get the starter. She needs flour. Like, I just made an excuse to disengage. And I knew no harm was happening, but I knew that everybody needed a break. And so this is something that we've really been talking about, is with isolation and so much going on right now, we really need to rely on our community and our neighbors and the people that are nearby us, even though we're social distancing, to hold up and check in on individuals. And so we're really working on, how do we provide that resource for people? How do we provide that resource for parents? How do we give people those skills to check in on the neighbor? So that's something that we're really, really aware of, and we're working really hard to help provide people with that tool.
Kind of like that interruption, it breaks the cycle, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's part of that bystander prevention, that bystander intervention program. There's directly intervening, there's distracting, and then there's delegating. And so that would be a great distraction from the moment, and it just diffuses it for a little bit. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about your bystander awareness and intervention tactics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I've found is that the majority of people in our community don't want to see people harmed, right? But not everybody knows what to do. We all have different personalities. We all have different barriers to doing something or intervening. Somebody might have their own trauma. Somebody might not know how to say something. Somebody like me might be 5 feet tall and afraid to do anything directly if it looked really dangerous. So we talk about the three different ways to sort of get around those barriers, right? A direct intervention doesn't have to be with the person who's doing the harm. It could be with the person who's being harmed. So that could just be a little check-in with somebody. It's a text that you send. Maybe you have family or friends or a neighbor and they're in a relationship and you're not sure what's going on, and you just send them a text. I'm checking in. I care about you. I want to see how you're doing. Is there a way you can reach out to me? And so that's sort of that direct piece. Um, the distract is really good for people that don't know. Maybe you don't know the neighbors really well, or you don't know the people really well, or you're not sure what you're seeing, and so you're a little kind of like, I'm not so sure, but I feel like I should do something. And a really good one for that is like, oh, hey, the neighbors up the street's dog is loose. Have you seen that brown dog? And kind of what that does is it lets people know, like, I'm here, I see you, I care. Um, and they're gonna be like, the neighbors don't have a brown dog. Like, what's your deal? And you're like, oh, okay, just letting you know. And the most important thing with anything that we do is that your ultimate safety is just as important. So that's where that delegate piece comes in. If it's a really dangerous looking situation, don't get involved yourself, because we need you to be safe as well. And so that's delegating, potentially calling police. But that could be delegating to another neighbor. That could be asking for help from somebody else. That could be a household partner, like, hey, we're going to just go walk the dog together and be a presence in a situation. And the thing is to think about what your barriers might be ahead of time, and start getting creative to kind of think about, okay, well, how would I get around that barrier? Yeah, distract is one of my favorites, and it creates opportunity. It might not stop everything in the very, very big, but it creates opportunity. And it creates opportunity to provide resources for individuals. So that's sort of like a little glimpse of the bystander program. Yeah.
So your slide with all the various training topics, do companies just kind of go through that and then pick a couple if they want somebody to come in, or how do you decide what you're going to teach to whom?
Well, so that's a good question as well. So, a lot of organizations are required to have sexual harassment training. So that's a really basic. They're like, we don't know how to do it, so we're gonna ask STAR. They're professionals. They know the community. So that's a lot of times a jumping off point for conversations that we have with organizations. And what happens from there is they're like, oh, that was actually a really dynamic, kind of cool conversation. And they'll say, okay, what else can you bring to us? And so we'll just sort of start a conversation, and we'll say, well, what do you feel like you're interested in? We do wellness in the workplace as well, so that's a really big one.
Okay.
What happens sometimes, though, and this is just the way we are with society, so nothing wrong with it, but what happens a lot of times is that something will happen somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're like, oh, this happened, now we need to talk about it. So it's sort of a reaction to an incident. And so that could look like somebody was experiencing cyberbullying or bullying in the workplace or with kids. And then they're like, oh, we experienced this once, now we need to start this conversation on it. So that's usually how that really goes.
Mm-hmm.
We love partnerships with organizations like the National Park Service and NOAA, to where we just sort of start a series of trainings, and we build on those. We do the same thing with Clithrow. which is a substance abuse program for men and women through Salvation Army. So that's sort of how that starts.
Can you tell us a little bit about Alaska specifically and their statistics, and or what is your hope for the future of Alaska with us having this really nasty rating?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you know, and I'm just looking at my time, so I'm good. I had no idea. So I actually went to school because I wanted to be in the special education program with really young youth. That was my dream. And so I went to school to be an educator, and I decided kind of quickly that I really liked working with special education kids, but I wasn't really super fond of the structure of some of our schools. So I decided to be a bartender, and then I was a truck driver, and then I was a tour guide, and then I was a fishing guide, and then I've done all of the jobs. And I did not know growing up that we had the highest rates of violence in the nation. We have the highest rates of sexual violence in the nation for adults and for youth. Our rates for adults are 3 times higher than the rest of the nation, and our rates for youth are up to about 7 times higher than the rest of the nation. This was not clear to me growing up here. We didn't talk about it. I didn't see it personally, and if it was happening to people I knew, it wasn't a conversation that was being had. And so when I was tour guiding, people would get on my tour bus and they'd ask me all these Alaska facts, and they'd try to stump me, and they couldn't because I was really good at my job. But one day somebody got on my tour bus and said, "Oh, hey, you know, how safe am I here walking downtown? I heard you guys have the highest rape rates in the nation." And I didn't know what to say. And so I looked it up, and they were obviously right. So I started talking to my family and my friends, and it does turn out that every single person I know had been impacted personally. So themselves or a friend or a coworker, they knew somebody. And so that's when it really hit home for me that these aren't just numbers, that these aren't just rates of people. Like, these are people that I know and people that I care for. And so that's where I started to look for, like, well, what can I do about this? Like, I need to do something about this. And I found STAR. I hadn't heard about STAR before that. And I decided that I really wanted to do that proactive prevention piece. And prevention is still really reactive, but it's that proactive before it happens piece. That's the hope I have for Alaska. Like, that's where I want to see more people getting involved. And that's also where bystander intervention can come in, because it's not just reactive. Like, there's things that we can actually be doing every single day that set really, really clear messages that we don't tolerate sexual violence and that we anticipate everybody to do something. And that can be something as small as telling a person that you talked to today about STAR. Like, that right there is a proactive piece. Let them know they have a prevention team. Did you know that STAR talks to people about preventing this? So, like, right there, that's something that we can do. And so my hope is that we really, it takes momentum. Really big changes historically have been made by individuals making choices. It's not one person who had this grand idea and then it just happened. It's all the people that made individual choices that led up to a major event happening, like something big that happens. And so I'd really like to be able to provide resources for people that want to get involved. There's lots of different ways we can do it. I know that, one of the big things that we give to youth is to shut rape jokes down. Like, just be like, that's not funny. Like, we don't joke about rape. And youth use it. It's easy. They're like, oh, right?
Yeah.
Because I know, and it seems kind of silly, but that's the conversations that we need to start having. Because it's not funny, and that perpetuates rape culture, which just creates a culture that is tolerant of harm.
Or
And
you're
so
more numb to it.
yeah, exactly. So we want to start doing the opposite. We want to start creating community that we know doesn't tolerate power-based personal violence. So, that's my hope. I think that each person, our voices matter, and we need to elevate those voices and hold them up and be microphones for people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm gonna see if anyone else has something to ask.
Hey, this is Deb Morse. I don't have a question, but just a comment. First, thank goodness that all the other careers you tried didn't work, because this is your calling. I mean, you are you are amazing at this, and I'm so impressed with everything you've said, and particularly as a grandparent of a couple of young girls in the school district. I'm so glad you're there, doing what you do. So, kudos to you, hats off, and thank God for you. You're doing a fantastic job.
I got goosebumps. Thank you. I really, really appreciate hearing that. That means the world to me. It really does. That's what keeps me doing this job. Like, if I can help encourage and support, like, that's why I do this. So thank you.
You're good at it.
Thanks.
I have a question for you. So I've kind of heard, I heard you say that a lot of the statistics that we have, and us being one of the highest with the abuse in the nation, is driven by some of the rural numbers. Is there a breakdown, like urban versus rural areas, or is it kind of across the board?
So, it's actually really interesting. Is that the highest rates per capita in Alaska are Fairbanks first and then Anchorage. And that's per capita. So if you kind of do that breakdown, the highest rates aren't actually happening in villages, but they have such small numbers that impact is really, really huge. So the majority of the violence is happening in the larger areas, but it's a lot of the isolation and those components that are impacting those numbers, if that makes sense. I know that seems a little confusing, but it is, the highest rates are in Fairbanks and in Anchorage.
Gotcha. One other question. Is there anything, obviously, you're on an amazing mission to educate and draw awareness kind of on an individual front. Is there any like policy or anything else? I guess kind of two questions is like, what are some of the biggest drivers right now of the violence? And is there anything on a more widespread basis that's done that we can do statewide, or policy that's being done to help drive down numbers?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, at STAR, on our Facebook page and on our website, whenever these policies come up, we're going to be putting notifications out there. Like, if this is a policy that's being put into place, and we absolutely try to impact policy. One of the biggest things, and it actually happened really fairly recently, which was huge, was making non-consensual contact with bodily fluids an assault, which ties into a whole lot of things that had happened in the past that wasn't considered assault. And so, STAR worked a lot on making sure that people who are harming are being held accountable. So making sure that, we worked really hard to make sure that strangulation was considered the use of a weapon, and so high, because we know that the lethality of that is very, very high. If somebody is strangling somebody, then the chances that they continue to harm or kill that person is very high. We worked really hard on passing the Safe Children's Act, which is what helped put into place that the school districts across the state was required to teach child sexual abuse prevention. So we lobbied really hard for that as well. So anytime those policies or anything like that comes up, we're going to be putting blurbs out on our Facebook about where they are and what you can do and how you can help impact that. Letters you can write, people you can contact, testimony that you can make, virtually for Congress or various things like that. We definitely try to keep on top of that. Another one that we're working really hard on changing is right now village safety parole officers are allowed to have domestic violence and sexual violence charges on them. Not just accusations, but they can actually be charged with and prosecuted for and still be a village safety parole officer, which means the only person in a village that somebody's supposed to be able to report to could potentially be a prosecuted domestic violence abuser or sexual violence, an individual who's harmed somebody violently. So that's something that we're working on changing as well, because we need to have safety parole officers that are safe people to go to.
No, definitely appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. It's a great question. Thank you for asking.
Any other questions? I'll go ahead and ask another. Do you have any comments or insight into or trends? People who have had stuff like this happen to them, some of them are able to, on the surface, like go on and just have what appears to be normal functioning lives, and other people, they just like totally fall apart and go into drugs or isolation or just, whatever it may be, the spectrum. Like, do you have a sense on how how many are in one group versus the other? Or I know there's various reasons for that, but what the after effects are, I guess.
That's a really, really hard one to kind of narrow down, and that really gets into the neurobiology of trauma and how trauma impacts our brains, and how consistent trauma never lets our frontal cortex go back online. And I know that's a whole lot of jargon, but what happens when people experience trauma is your frontal cortex, which is your that frontal thinking, that just goes offline. And this is any kind of trauma. I mean, that can be like a major earthquake, that can be a car accident, that can be a bear chase, that can be trauma is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And we start running on what we call that reptilian brain, and that's just instinct. And what happens when individuals who might experience trauma keep experiencing trauma, so maybe they were assaulted and they still have to see the person who harmed them, or maybe they were assaulted and they're struggling with housing and they don't have a home and they don't know where they're going to sleep, or they're concerned about their kids. That's all not letting their frontal cortex go back online. And that's where coping with drugs and alcohol, or even unsafe behaviors, so promiscuity, all of those things start to kind of snowball and take over. And so, we can't really say how many people are where, but again, when we talk about policies, and I see initials HR, and I'm sorry I missed your name, but this is also where other really big policies can come into place to help people overcome trauma. So we're looking at making sure that there's enough mental health help in Alaska. There's a 6-month waiting period to get into a mental health institution of any sort just about here in Alaska. There's a 6-month waiting period to get into rehab in Alaska. Our people who are experiencing a lack of housing is huge, and it's not always their choice. So when we look at policies and procedures and helping prevent trauma, and helping people recover from trauma, there's layers and layers and layers that can be assisted. And that might be where somebody else's passion is, making sure that people are fed. If you were harmed and you've experienced trauma and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, it's really hard for everything to kind of come back online and for you to re-regulate. And so there's a lot of different things that we can be doing to help with that. But I can't say who's where because those numbers are just really hard to come to.
What do you mean by like coming back online?
So whenever your prefrontal cortex goes offline, like that forward thinking is gone, it actually takes 24 hours for everything to regulate. It takes 24 hours for our neurotoxins to go back to normal levels. It takes 24 hours for our forward thinking to fully come back, like biologically. That's just how long it takes for it to happen. And sometimes people can experience trauma and be like, all right, like an earthquake, right? That big earthquake we had, and then people were like, oh, we need to get water and the dogs and food. And it feels like frontal thinking, but it takes actually a while for that to really fully come back. And so that's kind of what I mean by like coming back online. And so what happens is if it's taking 24 hours for our biology to completely reset, but it keeps getting interrupted, it's not able to reset. And then that's where folks very easily turn to other unhealthy coping skills, because everything's just sort of out of whack there, and we're searching on how to bring that back in.
It's very complex.
There's a lot that goes into that. But there's also a lot of things that we can do. Like I've learned great coping skills, like grounding techniques. Like 1 thing I can smell, 2 things I can see, 3 things I can feel, 4 things I can hear, or 1 thing I can taste, 2 things so you kind of use your senses to bring yourself back in. I use that a lot, especially now with COVID, because life is tough. And so I will a lot of times just find myself like, okay, what can I see? What can I hear? How can I kind of regulate and make sure that my cup is full for other people?
All right, we got about 6 minutes left, so
awesome.
Wanted to open it up again for any final questions from anybody else, and then let you share your closing remarks. I don't know. I thought you had something else to share. I wasn't clear.
I don't know. I think what did I write down? Because we did. I wrote some stuff down. And I tend to start to talk fast, especially when I don't have people like physically in front of me and I can't see anybody's wonderful faces. We do have, like I did mention, we have a crisis line training coming up. It's going to be a virtual crisis line training, so it's going to be all online. STAR prevention and education team members are going to be providing a lot of the presentations on Teams. And so if anybody is interested in volunteering for us, or if you know somebody who might be interested in volunteering for us, that is a huge, huge thing that we need to be able to do the work that we do. The crisis line training is really fun and dynamic. We do a lot of really interesting topics, and we talk a whole lot about wellness and self-care, which is really, really important. So, I want to kind of throw that out there. You can get on our website and look at volunteers, and there's a little spot there if anybody's interested in signing up for our upcoming crisis line training. You can also get online, and if anybody's interested in having a virtual presentation of any kind for a group of people, let me know. This is actually a really unique time, because this could be to your parenting friends. Like all of a sudden, whenever we're doing this, it doesn't necessarily have to be a professional organization. So, if you have a group of moms, especially with people that are homeschooling right now, like if you have a group of friends or a group of moms or a group of people that might be interested in having a kind of organic conversation but needs some assistance, let me know. because we'd love to be able to start to provide that information and provide those services for people. We don't charge a fee for our presentations. That's not something that we've ever done. And so, you know, we'd really like to be able to sort of to cultivate that community for folks. So I think that that's sort of something else that I'd really like to mention. You know, being creative and thinking outside of the box, and who we can connect with. I do a lot of work with the youth in Kodiak, so we do a lot of Zoom presentations with them and their teachers, and it works really well. So I kind of like to throw that out as well.
Good. Yeah, I hadn't considered that element of just getting together a group of, you know, parents.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that you all honestly are the best resource for us at this time, you know, especially with like, because pre-COVID, we were always like, well, how do we get a hold of just like this, like a group of parents who want to get together?
Mhm.
Like, how, you know, so now I think is just the perfect time to really foster that, and see where we can go with it. I know that, like me personally, I've contacted some of my friends and family, and they're doing some sort of co-education with their youth online, and they were like, "Ooh, could you talk to like 5 of us about?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, absolutely." But you know, letting other people have that opportunity too, I think is important. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So is it just you doing these trainings, or do you have some folks? And
I have an amazingly dynamic team of people. One of our prevention specialists, her name is Sierra, and she was actually my intern about 4 years ago. And then she graduated and took the summer off. And I was like, girl, if you want a job, I need you to come back. And she is so fun and amazing. I love her. And we also have a gentleman by the name of Brooks. Who was formerly with Identity, and so he has an immense amount of knowledge on LGBTQ plus communities. And so I have 2 other dynamic individuals that do presentations. So if you request a star presentation, you might get one, you might get all of us. You never know. We might all decide that we want to be there with you all, but we have an amazing team. Star in general just has an amazing team. We have just the most fantastic folks, and yeah, they're just wonderful. Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to reach out to you after this.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I
questions.
think that you have my email, my work email. You're more than welcome to share my work email with individuals that were
Okay.
on this. Yeah, so please feel free to share that. That's the best way to get a hold of me.
Perfect. Sounds great. I'll go ahead and let you go, and thank you again so much. Talk soon.
Okay, thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
You're
Thanks,
welcome.
Marie. Great discussion.